Hey, I'm Steve Acker. Today I'm at the Milwaukee Civil War Roundtable. They've asked me to speak on the 36th Wisconsin Infantry, and I'm looking forward to this beautiful facility with all these knowledgeable folks of giving the best presentation we can for you at home and those who are here. So thank you for paying attention. Guys, how is everyone today? I'll jump around a lot. I can't sit still. Actually, you talk about the historical fiction. Someone asked me why the 36th, and Iron Brigade's great. It's a great story. They're iconic. Last summer, I was volunteering for the Gettysburg Foundation, so I was in Gettysburg for a week, and I stood on the Emmetsburg Pike by the fence, and I knew Rufus Dawson was 175 paces to the railway cut, and so I walked those 175 paces, and I looked down the cut, that deep cut, felt bad for the 2nd Mississippi being buried in there, and it's a great story. But there's more stories to Wisconsin regiments, and we all know that. Jerome Watrous, member of the 6th Wisconsin, was a journalist after the war, and that's where that line, "Don't forget the latecomers," showed up. And I think this is a dedication to the latecomers. I'd like to read some names of those latecomers to you. This is really the story of David Kuhn, James Aubrey, Dielton Tishner, Wilhelm Kruger, Charles Erntinger, John McLaughlin, John Black, Clement Werner, Osgood Heart, John Thomas, James Cannon, George Alby, and Frank Haskell. These are the men of the 36th Wisconsin Regiment. You may have recognized one of those, again, from the Iron Brigade connection. And so, you ready for the journey? It's pretty cool. This is one of, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, this is one of 7 flags at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum that are ID'd to the 36th Wisconsin. I thought this was a cool one to start out because if you look to the far right, you can see their first engagement was Totopotomoy Creek. And then North Anna, Totopotomoy Creek, Cold Harbor, Strawberry Plains, Deep Bottom, Ream Station, Boynton Clang, Hatcher's Run, Richmond, High Bridge, Farmville, Lee's Surrender. I call this program all in a year because if you notice, their time of service was about a year. I was talking to someone earlier about this, that they missed a chunk of the Overland Campaign. They didn't see the horrors of the wilderness or the mule shoe, but they saw plenty in their time of service. And so we're going to spend some time with how and what this regiment did in these places. This is an 1878 photograph of the veterans of the 36th at a reunion. This is outside the state capitol. And when I found this photograph, it's on the internet, like everything, is a couple things I noticed. Do you see all the standards, all the colors to the left-hand side of the image? You see the drums? More importantly, you see the reunion ribbons on there? When I look at this image, I see a regiment that was proud of its service. Because you don't have a reunion if you're not proud of what you had done. And so when we look at what they've done, there's a question I have to ask. And it's a question I ask myself. If they're so proud, why didn't they join in 61? Or 62? Or 63? Why did they wait for Lincoln's February 1st call for 500,000 volunteers before they signed up to serve in the blue? And that's a conversation I'm going to share with you right about now. This is a recruiting poster for the 23rd Michigan, but I think it'll do a nice job for us. If you look at the very bottom, government bounty, $300. State bounty, $100. Town bounty, $100. Now I did a Google inflation rate, and supposedly $300 then is about $5,000 now. That's a fair amount of money, would you agree? So that becomes a motivator for these fellas to simply, for guys who are supporting their families and trying to feed their families, that's a lot of money. Now the second line I want you to pay attention to is, my ride's here. Okay, good. No, not yet. Enlist before April 1st. Why? Because on April 1st, the government bounty went from 300 to 100. No doubt trying to motivate people to get in, join the Army, get trained before the roads dried in Virginia and Georgia and stuff like that. And then, of course, you cannot ignore the big, bold black to keep out of the draft. On April 15th, the bounty was over, and there was going to be a national draft. So if you're there, if you know you're going to go eventually, why not sign up? The 36th Wisconsin was a volunteer regiment. You could also say they're a bounty regiment. Not every man, but a large number of them. So I want to share some quotes. I want to introduce you to one of the members of the 36th Wisconsin. He is a 42-year-old father of 4, named David Kuhn. I'd like to read his account to you. There was a man from Green Lake Town on the car that wanted a few men for the town quota. See, what happened is, the state got its levy, counties got its levy, towns got the levy. So town agents were everywhere trying to find bodies. They offered $200 to be deposited in the Bank of Ripon by the 1st of April. He took my name for one, but found on getting here that he didn't want me. So I engaged another man for $165 cash down, but found afterwards he didn't take my name down. And I got a number he wanted without me. So I went out again and found bounty. Eventually he signed with Green Lake for a $165 town bounty. So that's an example. 42-year-old man, 4 children, signing up for the money. James Aubrey, who is the chronicler of the regiment, wrote a regimental history, said this about the late war volunteer. The process by which men were made soldiers in our late war was one of the most remarkable things in that phenomenal conflict. Men had no taste for military life, no desire for martial glory. Men really too old for service forgot a few years of their life and persuaded the mustering officers to wink at the deception. I hope that gives you a feeling for the fabric of this regiment. Older fellas signed up for the money. There were some young ones, some 16-year-olds and things like that. But when the chronicler of the regiment says that, you get a flavor for it. Now, when we say bounty men, isn't there a stigma to that? They lack the sand, the patriotic zeal. Well, Dealton Tishner was a veteran of the 31st Wisconsin. He became a first sergeant in the 36th. Here's what he said about the men of his company. We have got the best set of men in Company H that I have ever met, with all steady civil men. We have not a drunken man or a quarrel or a fight in our quarters yet. Many of them are religious men and mean to keep it so. So I'll try to be as balanced as I can in this presentation of this regiment. But they are older, and they are, for the most part, bounty men. Anyone recognize this guy? Yep, Frank Haskell. Remember the 6th Wisconsin? Aide to John Gibbs wrote that magnificent account of Gettysburg. A man who his Latin professor at Dartmouth said the following things. Frank Haskell. Improved greatly in college, ranked well as a scholar, ambitious as Lucifer, possibly mischievous and irregular. So we can't cover all that, but we can cover ambitious as Lucifer. And I'm not an expert on Frank Haskell. When you look at him, he was a man who desired promotion. From the 6th to aide to John Gibbon, he coveted a colonelcy. He tried to get the 6th Wisconsin colonelcy, but Edward Bragg beat him out. He then tried for the 10th and failed. He tried for the 19th and failed. Now he has the endorsement of George Gordon Meade, Winfield Scott Hancock, and John Gibbon. And with those endorsements, he is finally given command of the regiment. And so that's the guy who's going to lead, who's going to build the 36th Wisconsin. Jerome Watrous, in that article he wrote after the war about the 36th, says this. Listen carefully to these words. Yes, he was a martinet, a soldier from the foundation up, and had known before he was liked. The farm boys and school boys, woodsmen, clerks, railroad boys, printers, teachers, and preachers of the 36th did not like him. He was rigid. He started to make regulars of them, as he had done with the 6th 3 years prior. They were volunteers. They didn't want to be regulars. They kicked and thrashed, but the harder they kicked and thrashed, the more thorough was Haskell's discipline. Can you already see a conflict of cultures? You have a reluctant force who lacks the patriotic zeal, who's there for food and family. You have a colonel who wants to be even more than what he currently is. He wants to make regulars of them. And so the great chemistry test here is, will he make regulars or will he make a failed regiment? And this story will explain that to you. The rest of the officer corps, there's 45 officers in the regiment, 22 of whom had experience, including that guy. I just had to. I'm sorry, Dave. That is, let's just say it, that's sexy. You're welcome, Dave. All right, let's get out of there. So, where does Haskell build the regiment? Camp Randall. This is a May 1864 drawing of Camp Randall, and I want to start there, but not spend a lot of time, because let's look at Frank Haskell's training regiment. John Black was a 41-year-old private in the regiment, and here's what he said. They drill us 6.5 hours a day, rain or shine. Our colonel is very strict, and everything has to be done in order. Does that sound like a man trying to build regulars? Now, Wilhelm Kruger has a little bit more to add to that. Half of our company wants to leave because our colonel is a mean fellow. We must drill 6.5 hours every day now in the mud so deep that it almost goes into our boots, and they don't care whether it rains or shines. So those are two pretty critical comments about our colonel at this point. And we can look at this two ways. We can see this as the whining of bounty men who don't have the sand, or we can see this as a brute putting his boot on the throat of the men he serves under. You can decide. But I do want to add this one layer. I looked up the training regimen for the 30th Wisconsin. They drilled 5 hours a day. And the leadership of that regiment during the rainy period or was inclement weather would have them drill indoors to protect them from the weather. So now you can form your own decision about Frank Haskell and what he's doing. This drill regimen lasted about 7 weeks. On May 10th, they are put on trains. They go to Milwaukee, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg, Baltimore, Washington City. And before they leave, before they get into combat, I want to share a couple of quotes with you. Charles Ermtinger says this about his term of service so far. I am very well satisfied of my present position, and as far as I'm personally concerned, I'm glad I came. John McLaughlin, if I only knew as much before I enlisted, I never would have been a soldier. So I'm going to keep throwing those quotes at you to give you the flavor of the regiment. I just think this is one of the coolest photographs. It's not the 36th, but it represents the 36th. When you look at these fellas boarding transport, getting ready to head down, the 36th spent a couple of days in Washington City, then they boarded ships. And as they were traveling down the Potomac, Colonel Haskell pointed out Lee's home and Mount Vernon on their way to Belle Plaine. Now, Belle Plaine was the supply depot at that portion of the Overland campaign. Okay, this is where it gets pretty dark. There's a couple of quotes I want to share with you that really may shed some light on the future of this regiment. Remember John Black? We talked about him just a moment ago. He felt the regiment wasn't ready. And he felt the colonel was way, way too eager to get into the fray. David Kuhn says this. There is a good deal of dissatisfaction against our colonel. There is a big battle in progress, and it's supposed that it is his intention to rush us right into the thickest of it without having had a chance to try our arms. Most of us have never even loaded or fired them off yet. And if we have to go in such condition, it will be nobody's fault but his. 6.5 hours a day, rain or shine. What was he drilling? Hand placement? Now, I will defend Haskell for a moment. They didn't receive their Springfield muskets until May 8th. But if you go May 8th, and David Kuhn wrote that on May 15th, should Haskell have been drilling his troops on use of their weapon? It gets even darker. Kuhn said this, I have heard some say that he will be among them. Yeah, there's active conversation amongst the fellows, and this is not just Kuhn. I've read a number of letters that subtly inference that Haskell would be better off dead. This is who he's going to lead into combat in just a moment. So the regiment joins the Army at Spotsylvania on May 18th. For those who know the history, the campaign's about done there. They start moving down to Milford Courthouse, then to North Anna. At North Anna, they do some picketing and some skirmishing. Well, one day, Colonel Haskell has his regiment form a line. The problem is, it was in sight of Confederate artillery. Confederate artillery opens up, one shot explodes over Company A, kills 3, wounds 4. Those are the first casualties of the regiment. James Aubrey is going to tell us why the colonel did that, and here it is. The colonel put us under orders to see if we would stand, and we did. Colonel Haskell said he was proud of that splendid body of men and that they would make a fine record, and they kept up like veterans. So according to Aubrey, Haskell put them in line, put them under fire to test their mettle, to see if they would stand. Is that an example of good leadership, or is that an example of a brute? Again, I will never make that decision. You make that as an individual. And so, what's that? Oh, stupidity? Yeah, you can make your own observation about that. But this is what happens. Now, what's that? It's easier, yeah, when you send other men into it. We haven't gotten to their first fight yet. The gentleman to the left is 6'2", 200-pound Clement Werner. He will lead the first assault of a portion of the 36th. A couple years ago, I had some fun. At the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, they have hand-drawn maps like the one you see to the right. These were drawn by 36 members of their campaigns. And if you go from top to bottom, it goes under the battle, Totopotomoy Creek, Bethesda Church, Turner Farm, you take your pick. What was happening is they wanted to fix the Confederates in their entrenchments so they wouldn't slide down the line towards Cold Harbor. And so the 36 was ordered to send out 4 companies, B, E, F, and G, totaling 240 men. To support them, they sent 2 veteran regiments, 7th Michigan. Now you know those guys, the guys who took the pontoon boats across the Rappahannock in December of '62. The 42nd New York, they had fought at Ball's Bluff. They've been in it for a very long time. Clement Werner is going to take us through the battle. And you can see in the red the trenches in the middle on 530. Confederate trenches attacked on 6-1, top to bottom. They were lined up in single file. Here's what he says. At the signal, our men in the 7th started. We were met with a perfect storm of balls. The New York regiment did not start at all. Michigan retreated in a few minutes. Our men charged right across the field up to and some of them over the works. They were met by shot and canister and musketry, 4 revs to our 1. We gave the order to retreat, but the men moved on into the very jaws of death. But when they broke, every man took charge of himself. When those 4 companies, the 36, went off by themselves because the 42nd never got up, and the 7th, they actually liked each other. A lot of references to that. The 7th said, we're not going. Can we blame them? They fought at Spotsylvania. They fought at Wilderness. They were dog-tired. Were they going to attack more Confederate trenches? You're going to see this theme recur over and over again. Of the 240 men of companies B, E, F, and G, 140 sustained casualties. That's their first taste of combat. Now, if you're in Hanover County and you're Mechanicsville, this is the monument to the 36th Wisconsin. It was put up by Charles Stork, a 16-year-old recruit who was wounded and captured there. And so it's worth going there, and the land is pristine. And if you take the accounts and you listen to the words, you can almost see that futile attack across that field. So how are we doing so far? Good. I'm having a blast, so it's really about me. Here's Frank Haskell again. We know Cold Harbor on June 3rd is a massive assault by almost the entire Federal Army against entrenched Confederate works. Our story is the Frank Haskell story at Cold Harbor. So if you look over to the right, I'm hitting with the laser pointer, do you see Boyd McKean's brigade over here to the right? On the right-hand side, middle way. That's where the 36 will be. They are in reserve in Boyd McKean's brigade. The brigade is lined up in column of regiments. So 36 is the very back regiment of this column of regiments. So they are not going in until there's a breach or there's a weakness and they're going to deploy it. To their front, you see Tyler's brigade. Tyler's brigade was advancing. They ran into an elder swamp which slowed down their movement, which gave the Confederates more time to fire. They lost 900 guys in this assault. McKean's brigade advances into that same elder swamp. Part of a hill protected half the regiment, but the rest were under a brutal fire. The brigade goes to ground, which is very common. Frank Haskell stands there. He sees Boyd McKean's body being dragged back. This is the magic moment, man. Frank Haskell wants a brigade. He has the endorsement of Meade, Hancock, and Gibbon. If he performs well, don't you assume there's a star in it for him? And here's the magic moment. There's 2 accounts of what happened on June 3rd at this spot right about here. The first account is in Gordon Ray's book and a lot of accounts, and it says that Frank Haskell told his regiment to rise up, and then they did, and they drew Confederate fire right away. When he saw them falling by the score, he orders them to drop, and they go to the ground, and at that moment, a bullet strikes him in the head, and he is shot, mortally wounded. That's one account. I want to read the second account to you. Colonel Haskell stepped out in front of the regiment, turned about, and was urging them to get up when a bullet entered the back of his head and came out the middle of his forehead. And so do you see how those are 2 entirely different versions? One saying, lay down, boys, I'm protecting you. One boy saying, boys, get your butt up and let's go. I don't know if Haskell was shot by his own men. I don't want to say that kind of thing. But boy, don't you start thinking just a little bit? Especially if the second one was true. Get up, boys. I don't think so. Okay, so this gets, okay, I keep saying it gets worse. It's like leprosy. Osgood Heart was a hospital steward in the regiment, and here's what he said. I saw the sergeant major coming, followed by 4 men bringing the colonel in a blanket. They laid him down under a tree and returned to the regiment. He was there about 2 hours, alive but unconscious, and nothing could be done for him until the ambulance took him to a field hospital where he breathed his last a few hours later. To me, here's the pivotal statement in that quote. They laid him down under a tree and returned to the regiment. They left him alone. A couple quotes for you about Frank Haskell's demise. Osgood Heart said this, "Had he lived, so great was his ability, he might have been a major general before the end of the war." David Kuhn said, "Our colonel is not pitied." John Gibbon, when he heard about the death of Frank Haskell, said, "My God, I have lost my best friend, and one of the best soldiers in the Army of Potomac has fallen." Captain Clement Werner, who you see that gentleman right there, said this in a letter to his brother later on. "The report that Colonel Haskell was shot by his men is stuff. He was shot by a Reb sharpshooter, but I am sorry to say his own men did not mourn him." And lastly, Jerome Watrous in that article finishes off our story. In the article I borrowed from this book, okay, General Gibbon called him an ideal soldier. So did Hancock. So did pretty much everyone who thoroughly understood him. But he was killed before the 36th came to thoroughly understand him. Great officer and reviled commander. You decide your relationship with him, but I think he was an important character for us to spend some time on because he built the regiment. And so now it's our task to see, did he build a strong regiment or did he build a weak regiment? And we'll find out. What about the men? So they went through Totopotomoy Creek. They just went through Cold Harbor. We saw the reluctance and the interest and stuff like that. David Kuhn said this. He's writing home to his wife. "I think you will not feel that my wages and bounty in money is easily earned. I now feel that money is but a small object compared to what it cost." Osgood Heart, writing to himself, said, "Why didn't you stay home? If you hadn't been such a fool as to enlist, you'd be safe at home now. Nothing can save you." A little hint of fatalism. Any of you planning on going to Cold Harbor? First off, take me with you. And secondly, if I'm walking out of the visitor center and I take a left, if you take the line of sight of these guns and follow it down the field, that's pretty much where the 36 fought. I was there 2 years ago and it was a tomato patch, but that's approximately where they fought, and you have a great field of vision of what was shooting at them on June 3rd. Okay? And now we move on. The Union Army is at Cold Harbor from June 3 until June 12. June 12, they start moving across the James River to invest Petersburg. You know, Petersburg is a major supply line, all that stuff that Will Green will talk about. I'm not going to. Let's go to the 36. How many of you guys have been to Petersburg? Okay, a number of you. How many of you have stood by Fort Stedman? This is right by Fort Stedman to give you a perspective. This is Hare Hill Ridge. This is called the Battle of the Melon Patch by the men of the 36 because they literally charged across the Hare Melon Patch on June 18th. And so visually, like I said, Stedman is over here. If you follow the tree line up the corner, there's the Confederates about 300 yards. If you're familiar with the 1st Maine Heavy Artillery, 850 guys go in, 650 guys are killed or wounded. That takes place in the bottom of the hill over here. That's a visual perspective. So, again, all-out assault. The Army attacks these works. They take the first line of skirmishers. The 36 comes up to a bramble hedge, blackberries and brambles. They're sitting there. The orders come for another charge. John Savage is now their colonel, and here's what he says. "Boys, let's give 3 rousing cheers for those 3 rousing cheers and charge those works for the honor of Wisconsin, ourselves and our regiment and the Army." The cheers were given. He pulls his sword. "Follow me, men." He cracks through that bramble hedge. He gets 10 yards before he's struck 4 times, and he falls. To give you a feel for the intensity of the fire from the Confederate works in that edge of that tree line of the horizon of this picture, John Thomas says this. "A mini ball struck my hunting case watch in my pants pocket, smashing it all to pieces. Another went through my waist belt, cutting plate, cutting a hole through the end of the plate, a loop of the cap pouch, and made a slight wound in my right side. A grape went through my haversack, practically tearing it all to pieces, and a mini ball went through my clothes, just grazing my left side. That's an intense amount of fire, don't you think? First off, very lucky dude, but that's an intense amount of fire. All right, so now we've lost Haskell, we've lost Savage. The third guy in command of the 36 is a guy named Harvey Brown. He was the nephew-in-law of the governor and a former beer delivery guy. He's got to be from Wisconsin. Here's what he says. We went over an old sod and hedge fence in the open field beyond. I received the bullet in my thigh soon after leaving the fence. I love this. But as the boys of the brave boys of the 36, God knows there were none braver, seemed determined to reach the enemy lines. I went with them until we received a volley that nearly annihilated us. Those not shot fell to the ground, I with the rest. Just as I fell, I received a shot across the spine, which paralyzed me. Now, he did survive his wound. Night falls, they pull the wounded out. In 2 minutes of combat, the 36th Wisconsin lost 5 officers and 111 men. There's a recurring theme. Harvey Brown said the veteran regiments did not go with him. They had done it too many times. The 36th goes on its own, suffers massive casualties, battle after battle after battle. They've lost half their numbers by now. Now, let me show you this. If you look at that branch to the left, Lieutenant George Alby of Company F, after the war, toured all of his battle sites. Actually, if you go to Groveton at the Manassas battlefield, there's a plaque, a George Alby plaque, because he was in the 2nd U.S. Sharpshooters. He went there and he cut that piece of branch off for another soldier in the regiment. The Wisconsin Veterans Museum has that. And yeah, I touched it. It's cool. Now to the right, how many of you guys have been driven through Columbus? Absolutely no one. Okay, you on Highway 60 near Madison? Yeah, okay, all right. This is the GAR marker there by the library. It is dedicated to Harvey Brown of the 36th Wisconsin. And so a little connection for him. So, yeah. I want to read a John McLaughlin quote. He wrote this in start of July. The 36th is very badly cut up. We have not one field officer left. They are all killed or wounded. I do not think we will make any more charges for some. The whole regiment is against making any more charges. They are starting to learn that it's futile to charge across an open field into prepared Confederate works. So, boom. These numbers I have up there, about 2 feet to stop a musket, 12 feet to stop an artillery shell. Henry Abbott was the colonel of the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery during the Petersburg campaign. That regiment was in charge mostly of the heavy siege guns. And in his report, he felt that that's the amount of earth one had to have to protect yourself from fire. You know, we think about Gettysburg, 3 horrific days. We think about Antietam, the bloodiest day in American history. We think about Fredericksburg after the battle, where both sides crossed the Rappahannock and went back to their cabins pretty safe, would you agree? Not at Petersburg. 292 days of near constant contact. If not the 9 separate campaigns, but then the daily grind of living in that. And this is where the 36 lived in areas like this. To give you a feel for how much lead was flying through the air during this period, now there were times where there were lulls and truces, but Bushrod Johnson's Confederate division on December 2nd sent out 1,100 pickets. In their 24-hour cycle on picket duty, they fired 20,000 rounds of ammunition. It was not uncommon for pickets to be told to fire every 10 minutes to keep a fire up the entire time. This is the life that 36 Wisconsin men lived in. David Kuhn, I'm going to read an excerpt from David Kuhn. It's only 4 sentences long. Listen to the details. We are now entrenched again behind breastworks, only a few rods from the rebel works, and as I write, bullets are whizzing over my head, and I just heard a shell go over from our side to them. Yes, there goes another. This morning, as I was digging the breastwork, a bullet struck the bank close by the side of me. Oop, there goes another shell. And a few minutes after, a bullet passed me and struck a man of another regiment about a rod from me. Mortally wounding him, I think. I have no doubt it was aimed at me. In 4 sentences, 3 shells went by. That's the amount of lead going through during this time. So let's make this even more miserable, shall we? How many of you have been to Virginia in August and July? Not relaxing. Now, of course, they had to have a heat wave during that period where there were subsequent days of 100 degrees. Let's make it even better. There was a 60-day period with no appreciable rainfall. These guys were scrambling for water. If you dug 25 feet, you'd get brackish water. If you dug 60 feet, you might get some decent water. These guys were popping wells everywhere, trying to get water, often putting their own life on the line to get to a water source. Check this out. This comes from a veteran. You have not the slightest idea how intensely hot it is here. The slightest exertion causes an instant flow of perspiration in profuse streamlets, taking the very vitality away from me. Stand outside 5 minutes and you will not want to move a peg for the rest of the day. Yesterday I was obliged to walk 5 miles in the scorching ray of the sun. I was nearly melted. I was good for nothing the rest of the day. You feel where I'm going with this one. Now, David Kuhn writes something very interesting about this time period. Don't forget, David Kuhn joined the Army to feed his family, his 4 children, 4 daughters, I believe, and his wife. Quote, I have been thinking a good deal of late that it was the best thing that I could have done to enlist as I did, for it has cost you $80 to get along thus far. There would be no way around it. I could not have made half as much if I had stayed home. Talk about a resignation and a realization. There is good news. On July 22nd, the Sanitary Commission brought him lemons, tobacco, and canned tomatoes. That was kind of cool, don't you think? Yeah. August 14th, we're moving chronologically. The entire 2nd Corps in the 36th crosses the James River, fights at Deep Bottom, Strawberry Plains. This will be their 4th commander, Clement Werner, is hit in the left arm. His elbow is shattered. He has his arm amputated. I read one account that said the 36th Wisconsin lost more regimental commanders than any Wisconsin unit in the war. And so we're at 4 already, and there's more to come. August 25th is really a military disaster. And so I thought it'd be interesting to break it down as why it was a military disaster. Number one, if you have a Corps commander that's still struggling with his Gettysburg wound, Winfield Hancock, he was struggling badly. He was irritable, almost incoherent in the pain. He was struggling to take his leadership. The 36th was up by Deep Bottom on the north side of the James River. On August 20th, they crossed the James, marched over 30 miles in the heat I shared with you to Ream Station, which is where our next engagement takes place. So again, the exhaustion of that heat. I didn't share the heat for fun. It's the impact on the regiment that we've been studying. They were 2 divisions at Ream Station, one under Nelson Miles and one under, of course, John Gibbs. They were physically exhausted. There had been works there from a June federal incursion, and so they occupied this works around Ream Station, but they never took the time to fix them up. Probably because they were tired, Hancock didn't give the orders, whatever the case may be, and there were gaps in these defensive positions. Now, on August 22nd, Gouverneur K. Warren had cut the Weldon Railroad at Globe Tavern, and that was the purpose, cut the Weldon Railroad, cut the supply line. These guys were fighting a little bit south, cutting the rail line as well, and they were challenged by 10,000 very determined Confederates, because that was a major supply line. They needed that. And so they had to fight back. And there's the cost of the Battle of Ream Station. This is one of the last great Southern victories. The Southern newspapers went nuts after this battle. It was another second Manassas in their mind. How many of you are ex-military? Okay. And may I borrow you for a second? Because you're a colonel, correct? I want you to show me something, and think about the command and control. Here is your brigade. And most of those regiments have been blood white. Do you see the challenge? Can you imagine trying to control that many regiments with the human voice and the bugle? And this is where the regiment found itself on August 25th, 1864 at Ream Station. So this is another hand-drawn map by a member of the regiment. I love these maps. So on August 24th, they had torn up some rail. You can see in the middle there's a sugarcane field. That's where they were resting. Again, they were in reserve. The Confederates, mostly North Carolinians, come up and start pressuring the front. The 36th is now put into line. Remember the story I said about the 6th Wisconsin and the railway cut? That wasn't, it was for fun, but it was for a purpose. The 36th was placed in the railway cut of the Weldon Railroad, which sounds like a great defense until you realize the berm's 12 feet tall. They were in the same position as the 2nd Mississippi was at Gettysburg. Too tight to maneuver, stuck in a stuck place. 20th Massachusetts, the old Harvard regiment, stuck right next to them. Confederates attacked 3 times and failed. Then they get superior position. They come in from the north and from this direction, and there is no fortification by this road. They come pouring into this area, completely surround the 36th, completely surround the 20th. 12 stands of colors are taken, and the 36th is captured almost en masse. Of the 175 men and 11 officers who served here on August 25th, on August 26th, the regiment called 3 officers and 46 men to the roll. The rest were killed, wounded, and mostly captured. In fact, 128 of them were captured almost en masse because they were stuck in a bad place. Ready for David Kuhn again? August 27th, it's 2 days after that David Kuhn is captured. He gets a letter home to his wife, and it actually makes it back to Wisconsin. It is housed in the Wisconsin Historical Society. Dear wife and children, I write to inform you that through the fortune of war, I am a prisoner. In battle of the 25th, about our whole regiment was taken. I should think in order to get to this place from where we are taken, it has marched about 20 miles. I can truly say that whatever treatment I may receive hereafter, I shall remember with gratitude and treatment received from the officers and guards who have us in their charge. Thus far, I do not remember of hearing an order accompanied with a profane oath since I was taken. And in this respect, I think our men and officers would do well to take the pattern. My health is good. We expect to go to Richmond tomorrow. Your affectionate husband, David Kuhn. So where does David Kuhn and 127 members of 36th Wisconsin go? Oh, I'm sorry, I screwed up. I have to go back and start over again. This is the Ream Station today. And if you drive down the Fairfield Road, that actually is the rail line. And if you stand right about here, this is where the 36th is. And there's still some berm there in the building. Okay, this is where they go. We all know about Andersonville and how horrible it was. This is Salisbury, North Carolina. This is where they were sent. At first it was a decent place until they packed 10,000 people into a 6-acre area. And as you can see from it, it was an enclosed space. The buildings weren't large enough to occupy everyone. The men built queer-looking holes. Some dug 3 feet with mud-thatched roofs, a hole being punched through the surface at one end, and a little chimney of baked earth on top of it. And this is where the men tried to eke out an existence. There was a man in the 22nd in Iowa who lost 100 pounds in 3 months. There was dysentery and all the things we know about prisons, but the biggest thing here was starvation. Sergeant James Cannon was one of the members of the 36th there. Remember that branch I showed you? George Alby cut that for James Cannon after the war to make a little connection. He wrote a journal, a very terse journal, just a few words each day. 11:6, I wish I was home so I could see my little family. 11:7, nothing to eat. 11:8, nothing for breakfast. 11:9, nothing. 11:10, nothing. 11:11, little corn coffee. 11:19, cornbread. Oh my God, deliver me out of this place. 11:20, nothing. 11:25, cold, no word, quarter rations. They were stealing all the time. It got so bad that the prisoners revolted and tried to take over the camp. They captured some guards, grabbed some muskets. They got to the main gate, and then Confederate artillery just laid waste to them. In just a few minutes, 81 prisoners were killed, that same number wounded. That's how desperate it got. Of the 128 men of the 36 that went to Salisbury, 74 died there. And they're buried in the mass graves. James Cannon, he made it. He was paroled in February of 1864. So he actually made it home. In James Cannon's, see, I love when history connects. When you take these different stories come together. November 2nd, here's James Cannon's journal entry. David Kuhn died today. And that's the last we hear from David Kuhn. He's buried in the mass grave in Salisbury, North Carolina. So, we're not done with their story yet. So as the regiment is rotting away there, The 46 I mentioned earlier, plus some replacements, we're a little over 100 now in the Petersburg line. This is the flag that they carried at the Battle of Ream Station. This too is the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and you can ask to see it. It's awesome to stand next to it. So when the 36 was captured, the regimental colors, the sergeant major tore it from the staff. It was torn up and actually got it away. The color sergeant of the Nationals was killed. This was captured by Captain Macon Cherry of the 44th North Carolina. Oh, excuse me. Remember George Alby? He too was captured at Ream Station. Wounded, he was paroled, he got wind of what happened. This is amazing. John Gibbon, his division did not perform very well at all. In fact, Nelson Miles' division performed much better. On June 22nd, a battle I didn't share with you because of time, his entire division was rolled up by 3 Confederate brigades near the Jerusalem Plank Road. If it wasn't for the 36th and the 20th changing fronts, his whole division could have been routed. John Gibbon had an issue. His division was falling apart. Hancock blamed the fabric of the new men. You can do what you want with that one. So here's what John Gibbon does to reinstill the steel that his division needs. It's called General Order Number 63. The following named regiments having lost their regimental colors in action are hereby deprived of the right to carry colors until their conduct in battle shows themselves competent to protect them. The 8th New York Heavy Artillery, the 64th New York, and I know you've already figured it out, the 36th Wisconsin. The officers and men of the command should understand that their colors should be the last thing surrendered, and that in a well-regulated military organization, it is considered a disgrace for a majority of the command to return from the field of battle without them. By command, Major General John Gibbon. Can you imagine the slap in the face it was for those 36 men who survived? Did the majority of the regiment get away? No, they were captured. But Gibbon needed to do something. Now, it gets worse. Gibbon posted the order in the Army's weekly newspaper so the entire Army knew about the disgrace, to no doubt steal the men. Hancock, Meade gave lukewarm support for this activity, and this is what happens. Now, George Alby comes back and hears about it, and he is upset beyond. He does something about it. He starts writing letters. James Aubrey writes letters. They write to the Republican governor and says, hey, help us out. The Republican governor offers an endorsement to George Alby. Mr. Alby gains an appointment with Abraham Lincoln. There's a war of words between all these different factions. Gibbon defending himself, Hancock and Meade going like, well, we don't kind of like it. Aubrey getting angry. At one point in October 30th, John Gibbon's like, hang on, Frank Haskell's my best friend. I asked for this regiment to be with me. Now in November, the quote only agreed to you. Sorry, I got so excited I passed my own line. Ah, well, it doesn't matter. But anyway, I promised that when the colors were restored, it would be presented to the regiment in such a way that the men shall feel for themselves a pride which should entirely overshadow any previous disgrace they may have been subjected to. Did he just blame himself? We're moving on. All right. It gets better. October 30th, or October 28th, the Boynton Plank Road is another major supply line. Grant tries to cut it. Clement Warner tells him what the regiment did here. At 3 o'clock, the enemy with a heavy force charged the 3rd Division, causing it to break, thus cutting off all communications with the rear. This is awesome. Seeing the perilous condition, Captain Fisk ordered the regiment to face by the rear wing, fix bayonets, and charge, which was handsomely executed, striking the enemy in the flank, doubling up their line, causing them to break and run, capturing a number of prisoners, and the color. In case you're wondering, that was the 44th Alabama, the NCO's 15th Alabama. You know what those guys were at Little Round Top, right? Pretty solid brigade. The 36th cleaned them out. General Egan, their division commander, said this about the 36th. I now depend on them with my veterans. He also said, no troops could have done better. So we look at the 36th and what they've gone through, yet the fabric of those men to charge across that field. Do you give credit to Haskell and his training, the fabric of the men, or both? I'll let you decide. Well, on November 11th, John Gibbon personally issues regimental and national colors for the 36th Wisconsin. The grind of Petersburg goes on until April 2nd when Lee's army retreats towards Appomattox. The 36th follows with. On April 9th, when the regiment hears about the surrender, quote, "There was no longer a line of battle. The soldiers threw down their guns, tossed their caps in the air, hugged each other, rolled on the ground, shouted, even cried, for the news meant the war is over and we are going home." Not yet. So we all know about the Grand Review on May 22nd for the Army of the Potomac. The regiment and the Corps, of course, and the regiment is camped on Munson's Hill, and they get the orders to polish your polish your brass, blacken your boots, brush out your uniforms, put on some white gloves. I've read a bunch of accounts from these guys, and every one of them is like, really? I just want to go home. Are we done with this silliness? And so they form up on May 22nd. Osgood Heart is going to take us through the story of the Grand Review. The dreaded morning of May 22nd dawned with a gracious smile upon the camp at Munson Hill. Moving up Pennsylvania Avenue, they soon forgot their dread of the day, for they found the walks on both sides of the avenue were masked with people with beaming faces, lustily cheering them. Here's the magic moment. They began to realize that, instead of being merely tools used for a great display, they were themselves being sincerely honored by those people for the part they had taken in the stupendous work of putting down the rebellion, destroying slavery, and reuniting the nation. I go back to that photograph that I showed you from 1878 with the veteran regiment. How much did that moment impact their perception of what they had done? Validate their service, validate their loss, give purpose to what they had done. And so that's what I'm closing out to. July 12th, they muster out of service, the regiment disbands, and they go home. Out of 996 men and 59 officers, with an additional 50 men joining up, here are the numbers for the regiment. Someone asked about these. 11 officers, 195 men were discharged. 88 transferred. 3 officers, 143 men died of disease. 7 officers, 142 men were killed or died of wounds. Only 21 deserted. Are you surprised by that? For a bounty regiment? 388 were wounded. 188 were POWs. 111 died in prison. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you. If you have any questions, I can make up stuff.
Are you still a public school teacher?
I am, until June. I retire in June.
I was a public school teacher.
Thank you.
I have a nephew who is teaching in my hometown, Melon, Wisconsin, northern Wisconsin. 23 years of experience, a master's degree. He's making $49,000.
Okay.
You could probably make almost $40,000 in a local mill.
Sure.
So his idea is now that I'm done.
Okay.
That's the superintendent for a pay raise. Well, of course, Madison locked up how you can tax the support school district.
Okay.
He's done.
Okay.
Now, what does that say for the future of the state of Wisconsin
Yeah.
education?
I'm not going to touch that.
Exactly, but I want to get back to the Civil War.
Yeah, thank you.
I made that point.
Yeah, you did.
I had a guy just bowled tonight, and we talked about what general got nailed by his own men. And he said, I had a college degree with a wife and a child. I got drafted. They wanted to make me a lieutenant. He said, so they made me a sergeant. He said, I got this 90-day wonder, which I probably could have become. He said, but got over this, Nolan, you're in the 90-day wonder. He said, but what was that really? He said, I've been around it. That's hot.
Yeah. Excuse me.
So he said, I ixnayed his order. Got back to camp. He said, I got busted. But he said, the thing is, you hear it coming.
Oh, sure.
Just like the Civil War.
Yeah.
Now, my mother's great-great-grandfather came over from the Gibbs and got off the boat and all the from his grandma. He was offered $500 a boat and he died.
Sure. Oh, lucky man. No kidding. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, please, sir. Well, Lincoln called for 500,000 volunteers on February 1st. Lukewarm response. He asked for 200,000 more in March. That's a 700,000 man levy that he needed in the field for the 64 campaign. Because as we all know, how many veteran regiments were leaving the Army through the summer of 64? You know, if you notice on that list I showed you with Ream Station, the 42nd New York was not on that list. They went home after Totopotomy Creek. And so my estimation, I think, significant. As far as your question about the bounty, Kuhn and Kruger wrote letters about they were getting their town bounty while they were at Camp Randall. They didn't get their federal bounty until they boarded the train for the war. The government had learned by that point not to just throw cash at guys who'd leave. So they made them stick around for a little bit. In fact, it gets even better. There was a lot of, they called it taking French, where the guys left Camp Randall because Haskell was a tool, let's be honest. But on May 5th, there was a rumor the regiment was leaving. Guys came back in droves. Why? They'd lose a $30 bounty and have to pay their own train fare if they missed the train. And so if that answers your question a little bit, yeah. And he did talk about through the war, before he died, of course, letters about how's the money coming, did you get it from Ripon, etc. So they were payments, not a mass sum, at least in Kuhn's experience. So good question. Over there to the left, sir.
I've always wondered about the training. In addition to all the marching, were they drilled in firing their weapons at stationary targets with live ammunition?
Right.
Were they trained to fire by the ranks with blank ammunition? Were they trained in bayonet drills? I always wondered what their training consisted of in addition to all the marching.
Sure. Well, I can only speak for the 36 because that's the only regiment. And if you notice, they didn't get their muskets until May 8th. Now, I don't know if that was a state issue, a federal issue, or what the reason was, but they were leaving on the 10th. So they wouldn't have had time in their 7 weeks to even touch a musket, to do any kind of even bayonet drill, unless they used broomsticks. So they did a lot of facings, marchings, turns, wheels, flanks. The maneuvering, I think, was what their thing was. And from what I understand, Haskell was all about when you stand straight, feet at a 45, finger along, you know, the details that made you crisp. And my first reaction, honestly, was, is he making bandbox soldiers or fighting soldiers? Are these a poster child for his success or men about to serve? And the fact that on May 15th, David Kuhn says, I haven't shot a musket? I'm sorry. I've been a teacher and a coach for 34 years. If my team has 7 days to learn a skill they absolutely have to have, I'm going to train that skill on the train. Does that make sense? Yet more than just Kuhn commented on their lack of awareness of how to use the very reason they were there. I mean, they're a weapons platform. They know how to use their weapons. So that answers your question, sir? Yeah, good question.
Any other questions?
Yes, Dave, I need a ride home.
Real quick question, Steve. The guys you talked about in the topic tonight, how many made it into the pages of the book that you are presently writing?
Oh, I'm writing a novel using the 36 as my background. I find the stoic warrior a fascinating subject. You know, not the patriotic zeal, just the blue-collar dude who's trying to take care of his family, going through the grist mill. Kuhn's in there, Kruger's in there, a few of them are. Yeah, and this is the bedrock of the novel. I always like to prove, I write novels, and it's got to be based on research for it to be believable and organic. And honestly, Dave, if you listen to the history, the stories just call for you. And so I'm just writing other stories. Hope that answers your question, my friend. Thank you, guys. This was awesome. I had a blast. I appreciate you.